Ta-da, everyone. I hope everyone's having a good post-Thanksgiving time in December. So we are entering the Christmas season. I've been doing some of these little mini reviews, so I'm going to try and get a couple more of those out as we get closer and closer to the time that everyone's buying swords, either for Christmas time or for the New Year's or what have you. So I have a couple things I want to talk about today as people come in. If anyone's on today, no one's in the channel right now, and that's fine. Then we can talk about swords. But I want to talk about some stuff that's going on. So I kind of have a secret plan and just want to get some ideas about it. So behind me, you guys can probably see here on the stream, I have a 3D printer, and that's allowed me to print, all sorts of little doodads and stuff like this that just are entertaining to me, but it lets me visualize certain things. So for example, I have created this 3D representation of the Thorpe falchion in England, made with very high fidelity based on specifications that were kindly provided to me by James Elmsley. And also, I'm able to sculpt things like this. This is a mace head. I believe the original was done in brass. Maybe it was in bronze. And this is a correct scale. So if someone wanted to, for instance, mold it, they could mold it and then from that mold do a cast and then pour their own copper or bronze or brass or what have you, and then you could make your own mace head, and then you could have your own actual functional mace head that you could put onto an actual functional thing. But something kind of useful that I created recently, I had a friend who was interested in a tulwar, and the problem with tulwar is tulwar hilts are very restrictive. They don't have a lot of opportunity for your hands to move around, and they're cast in a single piece. So the idea of the tulwar hilt is that you are going to be locked into the grip, but unfortunately, unless you have the sword right in hand, you don't always necessarily know if the sword is going to fit you or not. I had previously come up with a kind of weird device made up of a couple of different pieces that I could adjust, and it would kind of mimic the shape of a tulwar. It had a flat part and it had a square part at the top, and I could use that to kind of estimate what my hand size was like relative to a tulwar size, and that gave me some idea of the sort of range that I would expect tulwar grips to fall between. And that way I knew if I was looking at another tulwar, I could either ask for measurements specifically of the hilt, or I could estimate it based on measurements provided in the auction as to what size the hilt was. Well, I continued to do 3D modeling, and what I came up with is this. I call this my tulwarinator. So you put it together like this, and you can have a little thumb screw that'll go on, a little thumb nut. And using that, you can essentially adjust it to a variety of different shapes and give you some idea of how large or small a grip can be and still accommodate comfortably your hand. Whether something goes out, you can start adding these little washers or spacers, and I could make even tubes to adjust it. And the idea being that someone could print out one of these and come up with a range of sizes that you could measure between the disc and the cross and determine approximately how big is a comfortable range that your hand would be able to fit and still comfortably be able to make it inside of the restrictive tulwar hilt. So I've shown this to a couple of friends of mine. I've shown this to some Indian collectors. I've shown this to a couple of sword makers. Everyone seems to really like it. It's reasonably simple idea. This is something that, is just a couple cents worth of plastic to print. And so this is part of a kind of larger thought I had. So I have ideas that are sword related. I'm, constantly going in a million different directions. It's very difficult to keep me pinned down into one direction in particular. And sometimes I'm in the middle of research that I'd like to collect my thoughts on and put in a location, but I don't have a good way to disseminate it. Sometimes I put my thoughts on Reddit. Sometimes I put my thoughts on like posts on the channel. But I don't have a website. I don't have anywhere to otherwise share my information. Occasionally, I do write articles. For instance, for Matthew Ford. So always go and check out Ford's Military Antiques. But I also have little things like this that maybe I want to put together and be able to share with the greater sword community. And I don't really have a good way to disseminate that. So I've avoided it so far because I don't really have a need for it. But I'm considering starting up a Patreon page. So again, I don't have a need to quote unquote support my activities with either asking for, what is it, like YouTube Premium or anything like that. I'm not doing the YouTube channel in order to try and support myself. I have a 9 to 5, so YouTube is just a fun thing. But again, if I did like a Patreon page, it would be, I could have a free side where every time I come up with a new part of sword research that I want to share, I could just put it up there for everyone to have as an easy reference place. And then I could even have places where I could put things like this up so that if I needed a way to be able to send them to people or upload the 3D files or something like that, that might be something to do. And then if people wanted to, I don't even know what the term for Patreon is, subscribe or what have you, for $1 or something like that, then we could possibly see about using that to do things that otherwise I don't have the opportunity to do. So for instance, I know there's always requests for me to test swords on media that I don't have access to. So for instance, stuff like tatami or heavier things, textiles, gambesons, helmets, gloves, stuff that I otherwise don't have just because I haven't purchased them or what have you. So I don't know. Like, is there any interest in that? If I started a Patreon, would anyone actually participate, or would it just be me by myself talking to myself? I have no idea. Should I put up a poll on my page and see if anyone says yes, it's a good idea, no, it's a bad idea? Should I just go ahead and do it and see if anyone jumps in? Who knows? But it's an idea that I've been thinking of. Again, not with the idea that I need it to earn any funds. I don't really need that. But I think it might be a vehicle by which I can help disseminate additional information. And if everyone does want to chip in $1 a month or something like that, then as a group collectively, we can decide that those funds that the channel accumulates, we can figure out what we can do with them. If we want to buy a ballistic gel head or a ballistic gel torso or something like that to cut down. That might be interesting and something I otherwise wouldn't be allowed to have the discretionary spending to be able to otherwise purchase. So what else did I want to discuss? If we don't have too many people in the channel right now, but if I've had some swords come in recently, and that got me thinking about grips in general. So, for instance, this one by Romance of Men came in, and it has the two-tone grip. So it's got the leather grip here and the wire wrap here. And I really do like how it's done, along with the scent stopper pommel. The combination, I think, is really quite nice. And not only is it striking and it looks good, so historically this probably would have been done as a way to stand out, as a way to really show off and be a kind of striking appearance at a distance. Because remember, first and foremost, a sword needs to be eye candy or hip candy, I guess. And if you're not doing that, then why are you even carrying it around? So the sword definitely does stand out. It's got this beautiful two-tone, this dark and white, right there. Um, but it also feels pretty good in the hand. There are types of wire wrap that I like and types of wire wrap that I don't. Um, this one in the offhand, I think is quite nice. Now, depending on what type of longsword fencing you engage in, maybe you wouldn't like having that much traction. Maybe you need to slide your hand around more. And depending on if you have gloves or if you're barehanded, maybe you would prefer this or you wouldn't prefer this, because this does give you a lot more purchase than the leather. The leather allows you to kind of move up and down the grip more than the wire, which just kind of encourages you to stand there. I could imagine how, if you really wanted um, to give someone point, that having this extra um, anti-slip portion of the grip might be nice. In the same way that we have this riser here, so the hand goes this far and doesn't go any further. This is just all extra reinforcement to prevent the hand from sliding any further up the blade. And I could see that being kind of an advantage there. We see on S-Tox oftentimes they have kind of flattened pommels going on here at the top. That makes sense. Maybe you're bracing it either against the chest or against the palm and allows you to get really a lot of force going there. But I think that the idea is that if you're using this either single-handedly, or again, if your offhand, your rearmost hand is on the blade, and you're really trying to get a lot of force behind it, then you don't want your hand skipping and riding up once it meets resistance. And the wire grip, I think, really contributes to that. And I really like how it's done. And again, this one has, as you can see up close, it's got these kind of brass tacks that are in there both for decoration and to keep the wire from moving. And there are examples of that done historically. So I really do like how Romance of Men has executed. I have to say, considering this is their first attempt at European sword execution, they've really done a great job, especially considering the price point that this is being done at. Hang on, let me catch up with chat real fast, see how everyone's doing. What's Robert up to? Don't see many S-Talk. Why is that? Are they too rare? Now, I don't know if you're talking about in museum collections or if you're talking about in reproductions. If you're talking about in museum productions, S-Talk are not standard swords. So, like, if you want to say, why don't you see them compared to normal swords, it's a subset of swords. So it's not a standard type of sword. It's a specialty sword. So you're going to see them less frequently than typical swords. But they do certainly exist. If you're talking about reproductions, I have thoughts on why we don't see S-Talks in reproductions. A properly made S-Talk will basically have no edge. There may be some examples of S-Talk that you can cut with, but by and large, a properly made S-Talk is going to be usually quite stiff. It can be of similar weight and dynamics to a typical longsword. Again, some of them were huge, some of them were the size of great swords, but let's assume you're talking about a longsword size one. They are reinforced to the point that they're so thick, and you compromise that with breadth, that you basically have reduced its ability to cut entirely to make it stiff enough that you can use it for serious punching power. So you turned it into almost like a giant spike. And as a result, you end up, if you tried to reproduce that, you'd end up with a longsword that you can't do longsword activities with. You ended up with a longsword that's only good if you are mounted on a horse up against other guys in full armor. And most people who are buying modern reproductions of longsword do not fall under that category, so they're not interested in buying that. There's basically no market for it. There's only a very small number of people who would normally be going to, specialty smiths who are buying custom orders anyway. So I have seen, exactly that. I've seen custom done one-offs of S-Talk, but there's no market for like off-the-shelf S-Talks, or at least no one has done it yet. Maybe we can talk to LK Chen and he'll make us an S-Talk. But it's kind of the reason that sharp small swords don't exist. Almost no one's doing a sharp small sword yet. They were hugely popular for way more than 100 years. It's because people can't cut through water bottles with small swords. It's not what people think of as a fun reproduction sword. The Preval Saber has no edges. Yeah. Yeah, it's same idea. So that is kind of like the late 18th, early 19th century version of the S-Talk. It's the same idea. So if we turn S-Talk to mean a sword that you can use to deliver a tough thrust, then that would be a version of an S-Talk, but removed from the medieval period. Oh, do you have the cold steel, or is it a different version of a small sword? I'd be curious to know. I'm in desperate need of a small sword for another secret plan that I'm not quite ready to divulge yet, but I'm glad to hear that you do have a sharp small sword repo. While Robert is answering, I will continue talking about grips. So we mentioned that grip. Now, I so I think that grips again are cannot we really cannot enough. We can't overlook how important they are to the sword, and because how you interact with the sword matters so much. And here's another good example. So I was looking the other day at the dynamics of antique Chinese swords. And this sword that I'm holding here, if I just looked at it on one of my graphs, it would handle almost exactly like a Qing era Chinese sword. However, in practice, that is impossible. This will never, I couldn't hand this to someone who practices jianfa. I couldn't handle this to a kung fu artist and say, go to town, use this just like you would a Chinese jian. Why is that? The reason for that is because of the grip. So because of the way that we interface with the sword, even though on paper this balances and should be able to perform and handle dynamically just like a jian, in practice you can't. You cannot hold it the way, you cannot manipulate it the same way as the jian. This grip dictates an entirely different type of use for the sword, for the Roman sword, as for the jian. And I just wanted to take a moment to again go over how lovely the woodwork is here on Albion. Just like their metalwork, where there's not a rogue corner or anything that you're going to get caught on, or any errant hammer mark or anything like that. All of the woodwork is just absolutely gorgeous and just a pleasure to have in the hand at all times. And this is one where, some Roman swords, you really are kind of stuck, locked in, and it forces you to stay in a single position. And this does it to some extent, because we have this is a hexagonal kind of faceted grip here, which is, in addition to being hexagonal, it's also then scooped on each of the facets. So your fingers kind of lock in like that. But then in addition to that, we have this nice kind of flattened pommel section here. So while you're locked in there, you still have the ability to slide your hand onto the pommel area, which allows for the use of a handshake grip when operating the sword without it hurting the heel of your hand at all. this is just a really comfortable, really ergonomic sword. And it's thanks to the grip that we have there. It's really quite nice. I can't say enough good things about how this spatha interacts with us, and that's going to be very different compared to oh, which is the other one? So compared to, for example, this. So this Bronze Age sword has the big disc pommel on the end. This is going to be much closer to an Indian tulwar. And once I slide my hand in, it's locked in by the quillons, and it's locked in by not only the wooden portion, but even these little horns, these little brass horns, they're part of the tang that keep my hand in a single position. And now I can no longer at all put my hand forward into, there's no opportunity at all for me to slide into a handshake grip. It's keeping me into a single position for using this sword. So it's interesting because with this type of a sword, you would think that it would be designed primarily for the thrust, and we think of later period thrust point centric fencing as you'd want to be able to get as much reach as possible. Maybe you put a finger over the grip to better control the point, and you want to extend the sword as much as you can. So you want to engage in something like this with your hand. You want to get the sword entirely in line with your arm. You want to be able to put it as far forward as possible. The hilt really does not accommodate that very well at all. It really wants to get yourself into a handshake grip, which puts the sword at 90 degrees to the rest of your arm, which is what you find in cutting swords. Things like the Kelech, things like the tulwar, things like the pulwar. Very interesting. And this is perhaps what we have with the situation with the Khyber knife or the chura, where the chura was described as being an optimized weapon to be able to deliver thrusts, but for whatever reason, by convention, the Afghan warriors only used it for cutting, and they never delivered thrusts with it. So perhaps the same is true for this Aegean horned blade, where even though it looks on paper like it would be optimized for the thrust, because of the way the hilt is constructed, perhaps you hid behind your shield and then you only came out and gave a chop with it, and you only used it for thrusts once the opponent was down, and you can put it in an ice pick grip and then deliver thrusts that way. So that's very interesting. Just on a side note, this Neil Burridge piece is just really, really pretty, and it's a shame that more people don't get to experience his handiwork. It's just a really nice sword, and it's as the opportunities for people to play with Bronze Age stuff is just so diminished. So just real fast to compare it to the spatha again, you can see that between the Bronze Age and the Steel Age, swords have changed significantly in size. This is the spatha is a little bit on the big size as far as the early Iron Age and Steel Age is concerned, but the Bronze Age is pretty nice also. So let's see what Robert says. Okay, I have two versions, one Indian made and the other cold steel. The Indian made one is a 1767 brass hilted officer small sword. That's neat. I'd love to see pictures of that one at some point. I don't think that I've seen that particular design of small sword on the reproduction market, but always happy to be introduced to a new model of sword. All right. So the other sword grip that's interesting that I have been introduced to recently is a curved hilt. And that's this. So this is a Tachi from Romance of Men. So if anyone saw my video that I released the other day, it literally just arrived on my doorstep right before filming. And this is interesting in that this is a two-handed sword with a significant amount of curvature. So I have sabers that have this much curvature, but not any two-handed sword that has this degree of curvature. Most katana will not be this curved. So with Japanese swords, we measure curvature in sori. So that's the amount of curve between where the blade meets um, the habaki and then the tip over there. And usually it's measured between like 0 and 1 centimeter or so. This one has 3.2 centimeters of sori. So this is a very deeply curved blade. And the curve, as you can see, continues not only through the blade, but also through the grip. And that is quite a bit more. Do I have my other blade here? Oh. Typical katana do have curvature as well, but not to the same degree. So if I can hold the other katana up, I don't know how well that's reading on camera, but this is a more typical uchi katana. And maybe you can see that the suka, the grip, is curved, but not nearly as heavily as on the yellow tachi down here. And again, unfortunately the weather outside is terrible right now, so I don't have the opportunity to take it out to cut with it yet. But I'm really looking forward to seeing what this does to the performance of a two-handed sword, because the leverage that you'll get is going to be quite interesting. So the only other sword that I have that has this type of curvature is on my big greatsword, the Imperial Chengdao by LK Chen. So it's much, much bigger, and the handling's not going to be comparable. But this one is, longsword sized, but has quite a bit of curvature. And so whenever you curve a blade like this, you're effectively taking a longer sword and cheating it and squashing it and making it compact and into a smaller area. So I suspect that this is going to perform and feel like a sword bigger than it actually is in a kind of confined space. So even though I have on paper, only a 27-inch blade, my ability to create protection around myself and then be able to lash out with it compared to a straight blade is going to be significant. So it should be pretty interesting, and I can't wait to see how this works. I really like how some of the detailing was done. So it's done in brass, and I'm not sure if that's focusing on there. It's all very, very pretty. And it interacts with the hand quite nicely, I'd say. So even though the blade is not too unusual compared to an uchi katana, I think that the combination between the curvature of the blade and the fact that the curvature continues into the grip is going to make this for an interesting one to test performance-wise. So I already have a couple of tests lined up that I'd like to experiment with for this tachi and see what it can and cannot do. And then we also have this one. We have the Tatar saber. And this one is very interesting because it is completely unadorned. It is completely unwrapped. It has a bit of a pistol grip, as is common for these sabers from the Turco-Mongol heritage. So this is of, Crimean background. And it's got a reasonably light blade on it. But what was interesting is this particular fish skin. So it's not exactly Samigawa. They usually use sturgeon. That's the fish that's in the area that is used to produce this. And I'm not sure if it's just because of the type of fish or just because of the preparation. Perhaps it wasn't sanded down as much as usual. it really locks right there in my hand. Now, I've talked to other fencers, and fencers I know who say that they sweat a lot when they're practicing. If they have a grip that's made up of samagawa or fish skin or ray skin or shark skin, they say they love that because if their hands are sweaty and slippy and they get into uh, uh, this type of a grip, then the grip just does not go anywhere. It just locks into their hand and they don't have to worry about it moving at all. I personally do not have sweaty hands, so that's not something that really is necessary for my use of the sword. However, when I went out to do some cutting, I was performing a cut against a target, something like this, maybe a little bit denser of a bottle than that was underweight. So it had mass to it. It had water inside of it. And I performed a cut with some force, but for whatever reason, I didn't completely go through the target. So I hit the bottle and I launched it all the way across the yard. However, even though I transferred enough energy to send the bottle flying, a lot of that energy went back into the sword and right into the hand. And because my hand was completely locked into this grip, the combination of the way that this fish skin is in there and the combination between how the blade interacts with this kind of minimalist hilt, there's probably just a very small wood core in there, just gave me tremendous hand shock. That is probably the most painful target strike that I've ever done in my career as a swordsman. So that was very interesting. So this is one of those grips where the combination between the hook here at the bottom, the little brass pegs that we have here, and the ray skin, even though this grip is kind of minimal right here, just slot very ergonomically in the hand. And even though we have a kind of long, almost cavalry-sized blade, you never really feel like you're going to lose it in your hand. But the corollary of that, the other side of the coin of that, is that if you, for whatever reason, don't make it through the target, you end up paying the price for it, and it's going to come back and potentially bite you in the hand or in the fingers. So that was a very unpleasant experience that I got to feel in this particular saber. So that was something that was rather interesting. But just a really, really pretty sword by a custom smith. I'm trying to remember who it's by right now. The name escapes me. The Polish smith, Chiklovsky. I don't remember. I'll have to go back and check who made this particular saber, and that's my fault for not having it right off the top of my head. But yeah, so leather gloves might help with vibration. So I do have one set of leather gloves, but they're nice enough that I don't want to destroy them. So I might go with one of my work gloves or the like. But if I attempt it again, I will say that on most targets I hit with it, it sailed right through. So I don't think that it's a fault of the sword per se to perform. It was, if anything, it was probably a fault of the swordsman rather than the sword. Most of the time it performed admirably well. Didn't have any problem whatsoever. Here's another one that I haven't discussed too much about, another saber, because I'm always talking about sabers. So this is one by Passeri Handicraft. And I don't know that this one uses horn. I think that this is just polished wood. But this one is kind of interesting in its construction. You can see that it's almost a straight hilt. It has this kind of characteristic little hook here on the end, which is really good for catching your pinky against, so you can apply a little bit of leverage to it. So it's almost like the canted, angled saber hilt, but it's also almost just like a plain Jane straight sword. So it's got kind of the advantages of a straight sword where you can rest them in your palm here, and the advantages of a saber hilt where you can you can point it out there, and you can angle it with the lower part of your fingers and bring the point in line. So this one is really comfortable, and it has the typical Turkic style cross on here, which allows you to slide your fingers up in similar to how you would slide your hand up into a tulwar hilt, but a little bit more protection than the typical size tulwar grip. So again, another way to really be comfortable with it. And just to kind of bring the original point home, like how we interact with the sword really can dictate how you use it. And sabers are great examples for it, because let's say this blade was made in Germany. This blade could then be exported anywhere in the world and hilted by whatever group, and then it would be called that type of a sword. So if this blade were sold in Austria, it would be hilted by an Austrian maker and it would be called a saber. If it were sold to a Persian guy is going to put a Persian hilt on it. It's going to be called a shamshir. If it was sold in India, they put an Indian grip on it and they're going to call it a tulwar. If it's sold in Indonesia, it's going to be done in an Indonesian fashion. We have Chinese swords that have German blades on them, etc., etc. So sabers are always a good example of that, because so many different countries have kind of medium-sized length, curved, choppy swords. Again, usually they are preferred to have the native style of choppy saber, but we see plenty of times where they've imported blades from other locations and hilted them in the local fashion, and that's going to dictate with how they're used. Because if I put a tulwar hilt on this, it's going to perform slightly differently than if I have this Arabian Mamluk style hilt than if I put a Polish hilt on it. Example. And Robert points out that the French determines class type by hilt design as well, and that's absolutely correct. So the big divide in nomenclature. So there's a couple different ways that you can divide things. The two biggest differences in classification of swords are the French and British divide, and mostly that's whether you define the define the sword by blade shape or by hilt shape. In French, you look at the hilt first, and you determine if the hilt is a sword type or a saber type. And if it's a saber type, you call it a saber, regardless of what type of blade it has on it. And if it's a sword type, you call it a sword. The British are the opposite. The British determined anything that's curved is a saber, and anything that's straight is a sword, mostly. However, there is a third type, and it's fallen out of favor. It was something that was used more often in like the 18th century or so, and that is determining swords by performance. So the most obvious example of that, if we use English sources, would be that of the Spadroon debate. So prior to Spadroons, they had the classification of broadsword, and you had shearing sword versus broadsword, and you could end up with things that were broadswords based on if they were heavy in the end rather than what they looked like. So you could have a single-edged broadsword or a double-edged broadsword, and all that you needed was whether it was very heavy in the tip. If it was heavy in the cut, it was called a broadsword. If it was light, it was called a shearing sword. If it was double-edged, and if it was single-edged, it was called a backsword. If I'm remembering that correctly, and I may have that wrong. We see that in other cultures too. So, for instance, in China, Zhama Dao did not refer to a specific type of sword. It was the classification. It was how the sword performed, and in fact, it didn't even have to be a sword. Sometimes, depending on the dynastic period, Zhama Dao was even used for pole arms. So Zhama Dao, horse cleaving, meant big, heavy, chopping type of the military designation for big, heavy horse chopper. But it didn't refer to a specific look. Sometimes it was a big wide blade. Sometimes it was a long curvy blade. Sometimes it was a blade stuck up on a pole arm. It just meant though the sword that was with the troops that was there for chopping the sword. So it was a designation of performance rather than a designation by how it looked, or either by blade shape or by hilt shape. So there's several different approaches as to how we can classify swords. That's for sure. Thank you, Robert, for bringing that up. Yeah, very good points all around. Okay, I'm glad we had some folks that joined us for this evening. It's coming up on 10 o'clock my time, so I'll probably be wrapping things up. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I wanted to share with anyone. Please let me know if there's anything anyone online wants to ask or to see before I wrap up shop. I will be continuing to do several more of these little mini reviews before the Christmas season. So keep your eye out on the channel for that in the near future. Again, we'll see if I can. I haven't decided for sure yet that I'll put up a Patreon page, but it seems like it might be a place to collect the various pieces of research that I'm able to come up with, be able to disseminate, sword-related files that I'm able to produce. And again, if we decide as a group that if everyone wants to chip in a buck and then we can buy a ballistics head for cutting or something like that, maybe we can do that. Hey, it looks like Eric's there. Scabbard hardware. I'm not sure what scabbard hardware you'd like to discuss, but we can, of course, talk about scabbard hardware anytime. Would I rather cut or thrust or both? I think that is dictated by the sword. I mean, me personally, I'm probably less skilled at thrusting because most of the swords I have are very cutty, and I probably spend more time experimenting with cutting with them. I did spend a lot of time attempting to try and devise a evidence-based metric for how to gauge thrusting effectiveness from one sword to another, but I was dissatisfied with the results because I found it is really, really medium dependent. So depending on what you're stabbing into will wildly change one sword's performance relative to another sword's performance. So I was originally doing drop tests into open cell foam, basically archery foam, and I thought it was really good because a couple of doing comparisons with a couple of other things seemed to indicate to me that I was going to get consistent relative results. So if one sword outperformed another sword in that test, if I went somewhere else and did it with under other circumstances against another target, I was going to get the same relative hierarchy of swords. Further testing showed that to not be the case. And swords that perform really well against one type of target do not necessarily perform really well against another type of target and will be outperformed by swords that may have flunked the previous test. The biggest thing between that in particular seemed to be how the material breaks. So for instance, fibrous material in particular needs to be cut through, which means that a sword that is very thin and sharp doesn't even have to be stiff. It might be a floppy sword, but it can go through that material that might be like a net almost. So think about lots of textiles, think about silk, think about rope, things like that. All of those things, swords that might not have a lot of stiffness will still glide right through when you're thrusting at them. It's basically like cutting through them. A sword that has a reinforced point, like a rondel dagger, that you think you could put a lot of pressure on, they might not go very deeply through that type of target, because they will try and wedge their way in between all the fibers, and the fibers won't break, and they'll just lock them in the matrix. Whereas if you're trying to go through a target that is more prone to fracturing or more prone to deforming, like metal, PVC, plastic, ice, things like that, the opposite is true. So the sword that relies on sharpness won't necessarily go through. Sometimes it might, but it depends on a lot of factors. You're more likely to chip the tip off. And instead, that sword is going to hit, and then it's going to start buckling. Whereas the sword that has the reinforced point at the end, like a type 15 or a type 15A or an S-Talk, is going to hit and start to crack it, and it's going to form a little diamond, and then just open a little crack, and it's going to allow the passage of the rest of the cross section through the whole rest of the sword as you continue to apply force behind it, and you're not going to lose all that energy by the cross section of the sword deforming. So yeah, the point is, it's really hard to test thrusting effectiveness compared to cutting effectiveness. Cutting effectiveness is hard to test. Like, don't get me wrong, it's not as simple as most people think, because most people will take a bottle or something like that, and you cut it, and you're like, I cut the bottle. And you take another sword and you cut it, and you're like, I cut the bottle. And you're not really telling which of the two swords was more cutty, because in both cases you blew straight through the target. Like, the only way you know is if the sword was completely unable to cut through the target. So in most cases you have to, adjust your target so that you can see a spectrum of cutting. And you're trying to catch where the cut falls somewhere within the target. And that's not always easy to do. All right, Eric says, the sword from the unremembered one you just put down. The unremembered one I just put down. Oh, this one. Yeah. So you wanted to look at the Crimean one. Yeah, we can talk about this one at a later date, but it's a really pretty little like 16th century Tatar saber, and it's well done. I'll get you all the details on it later, but this is a very pretty Armenian or Crimean Tatar saber with some really pretty scabbard elements on it. Okay. Robert says, I naturally thrust mostly. For some reason, cutting is more fatigue inducing, it seems. If you're a fencer, I don't engage in fencing. If I were up against someone and I didn't know what I was doing, I would probably try and keep my point pointed at the other guy as much as possible, and when the opportunity arose, try and poke him with it. So yes, in that regard, I do think thrusting is probably strategically the better option. Is it always available? Who knows? But I'm not a great fencer, so don't take your fencing advice from me. The surface drag also impacted thrust testing. Oh yeah, absolutely. Surface drag is definitely measurable, depending on, again, it depends on what target you're dealing with. But like, for instance, targets that are dry compared to targets that are tacky, like, again, ballistics gel compared to targets that are lubricated, can definitely tell difficulty in cutting through them. So yes, I would say that surface drag will make a difference. Awesome stuff. Great discussion. Glad to hear everyone is having a good night, and I'm glad that everyone was able to join. So got a couple plans cooking up. We're going to be looking at some more fun swords in the not too distant future. Since Eric is on here and asking, I will tell you guys right now that saber is from here. I know where I'll look it up. It is, because oh my goodness, they canceled all of my I was trying to look it up in my database of all the dynamics that I have, but unfortunately, it my database closed, so I didn't have it up there. So it is from. I'll tell you in a second. It is from Wojciech Chiklavsky, which is spelled out here. I'll post it. Wojciech Chiklavsky. There, that is the name of our maker from Poland. I've looked up a couple of his other his other works. He seems to be a very accomplished smith. So give him some love. I haven't found a website for him yet. Otherwise, I would share his primary page so that everyone can go and see his work. But so if anyone does see where he's selling, I've only seen another outfit that he seemed associated with, but I didn't see any of his current swords for sale there. So if anyone does know where he's currently selling, we can circulate that on my channel at some point in the near future. All right, gang. So that is all that she wrote for tonight, but it was a fun one, as usual. And it's always a good time whenever we're able to get together and talk swords. So thank you very much for hopping on. We will be back here on the channel next time for even more swords. Take care.